In 1924, the city of Detroit renamed a street, not after a general, not after a president, after a truck company. They changed Levitt Street to Federal Street. The company had earned it, built on that block, employed the neighborhood, supplied 2 world wars. Federal Street still exists in southwest Detroit. The company does not. It died in 1959, and almost nobody noticed. America in 1910 was in the middle of something it did not fully understand yet. The horse-drawn wagon was not quite dead. The automobile was not quite proven, and the truck, the commercial hauler that would eventually hold the whole economy together, was barely a decade old as a concept. That is the year Martin L. Pulcher showed up. Pulcher was not a nobody. He had already helped build Oakland Motor Car Company, or the one that General Motors would eventually turn into Pontiac. He understood manufacturing. He understood Detroit. And he understood that horses were finished. He founded the Bailey Motor Truck Company in the summer of 1910, changed the name to Federal within weeks. The reason for the name change is not well documented. What is documented is that he moved fast. He set up a factory on Levitt Street in southwest Detroit, right next to the Michigan Central Railroad line. That was not an accident. Rail access meant raw materials in and finished trucks out. Simple logistics, executed properly. By 1911, Federal entered the Chicago Reliability Run. 9 days, 937 miles, round trip, Chicago to Detroit. Federal's 1-ton truck finished carrying 2,650 pounds the entire way. And it was the only vehicle in its class to complete the course under its own power. That was year 1. Detroit in those years was not just about passenger cars. It was about everything that moved on 4 wheels or more. Trucks were becoming serious business. Cities were growing. Freight was growing. Roads were improving, slowly. The demand for commercial haulers was climbing, and every independent manufacturer in the region was scrambling to capture a share of it. Federal positioned itself early as the workhorse option, not the fanciest truck, not the cheapest either, the reliable one. Continental engines, Waukesha engines, Hercules engines, whatever got the job done. The company was more assembler than pure manufacturer in those early years, which kept costs manageable and production flexible. By 1917, Federal trucks were appearing in cities across the country, a presence from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Pulcher's motto was simple: you can expect years of faithful service. Not a flashy line. Federal was not a flashy company. They built trucks and let the trucks do the talking. That approach worked for a long time. Then it stopped working. And that is the whole story. We track down stories like this every week. Companies that built America and then disappeared. If that is your kind of history and you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. We are just getting started. The commercial truck industry in America was not a polite business. It was not a place where gentlemen shook hands and divided markets fairly. It was brutal, cyclical, and unforgiving. And Federal was always fighting on 2 fronts. The first front was competition. Diamond T was the direct rival. They fought over the same customers, the same contracts, the same segments. Diamond T went chrome and flashy, aimed at the independent operator who wanted his rig to turn heads. Federal went practical and fleet-oriented, aimed at the company buyer who needed reliability over appearance. 2 different philosophies, 2 companies eating from the same plate. In 1923 and 1924, Federal was actually outselling Diamond T. Then Diamond T figured things out, took the lead, and never gave it back. That gap would widen over the following decades. The second front was the economy itself. The stock market crashed in 1929. What followed was not just a recession, it was a near-total collapse of commercial vehicle demand. Companies stopped buying trucks. Companies stopped buying anything. Federal's production, which had been running as high as 3,500 units per year during the good times, cratered to about 1,500 annually through the worst years of the Depression. They survived, Most did not. Before 1929, there were dozens of independent truck manufacturers operating across America. By 1935, the majority were gone. Federal was still there, smaller, leaner, but there. Part of what kept them alive was a contract nobody talks about. In 1934, the U.S. Army placed an order for 400 Q9 heavy-duty trucks, worth over $1 million. For a company fighting to make payroll in the middle of a depression, that order was oxygen. A lifeline arrived wearing military green. It would not be the last time the military saved Federal. But in the 1930s, it was the one that mattered most. The road from that 1934 Army contract to the biggest year in Federal's history runs straight through the Second World War. And Federal was ready for it. That was not a coincidence. Martin Pulcher had spent years building that relationship deliberately. Between the wars, he worked personally with the U.S. War Department to help modernize and standardize the military's truck fleet. Think about what that actually meant. The American military, in the years before 1940, was running hundreds of different truck types from dozens of manufacturers. Parts were not interchangeable. Maintenance was a logistical nightmare. Repair crews in the field needed 60 different sets of tools for 60 different vehicles. Pulcher helped the Army fix that problem. He was not doing it out of charity. He understood that if you helped build the system, you ended up inside the system. When the big contracts came, you were already in the room. Federal built its first military vehicles in 1918, right at the end of the First World War. The relationship was established early, and between 1934 and 1941, as the Army was quietly rebuilding its vehicle fleet in the shadow of what was happening in Europe, Federal was there filling orders. Dump trucks, tank transporters, wreckers, whatever the Army needed moved, Federal could move it. Then December 7, 1941 happened, and everything changed speed. The Federal plant on what was now officially Federal Street went to war production almost overnight. The 600-foot assembly line that had been turning out civilian trucks shifted to military contracts. The workforce expanded. The hours stretched. The plant ran at absolute capacity by every account from the period. What Federal built during those years was not glamorous. It was not the tank, the fighter plane, the aircraft carrier. It was the infrastructure of war, the trucks that moved ammunition to the front, the wreckers that recovered damaged equipment from the road shoulders of Europe, the tractor trucks that hauled impossible loads across roads never designed for anything this heavy. The Federal 94 X43 tractor was the workhorse of the campaign. Federal built over 8,000 of them. The Army Signal Corps used them to pull communication van trailers. The Transportation Corps used them for general freight service. They were everywhere on the European supply lines, which was entirely the point. The C2 wrecker was something else. 7.5 tons, 6-wheel drive, 6x6 configuration, one of the largest vehicles the Army Air Forces operated. This machine dragged damaged bombers off runways, moved B-17 wing panels around airfields, got things operational again when operational was the difference between completing a mission and not. The inertia starter on its engine, the same type used on combat aircraft of the era, tells you something about the conditions this truck was expected to work in. Cold, remote, no ground power unit nearby. The machine needed to start itself under any circumstances and then do the job. It did. The Federal plant on Federal Street was located just a few miles from Fort Wayne, which during the war became the motor supply depot of the entire U.S. Army, the shipping point for all Detroit-built vehicles and parts headed into the war effort. Federal's geography was, for once, perfect timing. Federal won the Army-Navy E-Pennant 4 times during the war, 4 times. This award was not distributed for showing up and doing the minimum. This was the military's formal recognition that a manufacturer had exceeded production targets and quality standards under wartime pressure, consistently and over a sustained period. By 1944, Federal was having the best year in its entire history, $34 million in sales, are 39% more than 1943. The plant was, in the recollections of workers from that period, genuinely bursting at the seams. Federal also did something unusual in 1942. It acquired the Stewart Motor Company, an older truck manufacturer that had been struggling. The move expanded the product range. It added assets and production capacity at exactly the moment the company needed them most. For a brief window, it looked like this could become something larger. Then the war ended, and everything changed again in the wrong direction. The end of the war brought the end of the military contracts. Predictable. What nobody at Federal fully anticipated was how fast and how completely the civilian market would transform. The men coming home from Europe and the Pacific wanted houses, cars, and futures. Companies wanted to buy trucks, but not necessarily from Federal and not necessarily from any independent. The post-war American economy was rewarding scale. Scale in manufacturing, scale in distribution, scale in marketing. The companies that had it were pulling away from the companies that did not, and they were pulling away faster than anyone in 1946 could quite predict. The Big Three had been watching the commercial truck market for years with growing interest. Ford and General Motors and Chrysler had the money, the dealer networks, and the brand recognition that no independent could match. After the war, they moved aggressively into the medium and heavy truck segments where Federal had built its reputation over 4 decades. Not just the light pickups they had always owned. The serious haulers. Federal tried to adapt. In 1950, they introduced the Styleliner cab, 3 abreast seating, Detroit-style design touches, an attempt to look modern, to compete visually with what the major automakers were producing. It was a good truck. A genuinely good truck. It was not enough. You cannot out-Ford Ford when Ford decides it wants your market. You cannot out-General Motors. General Motors when the full weight of that company arrives in your segment. Federal sales declined through the early 1950s, not collapsed, declined. There is a difference, but in this industry, the direction mattered more than the pace. Federal was still selling trucks, still had 300 franchise dealers, still had 50,000 trucks in service around the world as late as 1954. But the trajectory was down. And Martin Pulcher, the man who had started all of this and run it through 2 world wars and 1 depression, was no longer at the helm. That changed in 1952 when Federal was sold for the first time. Here is the thing about Federal trucks that the spec sheets and sales figures do not quite capture. They were not technologically exotic. They were not engineering marvels in the way a jet engine or a racing gearbox is a marvel. They were engineering solutions, competent, durable, practical solutions to the problem of moving heavy things reliably from one place to another. That is not a criticism. That was the entire point of a commercial truck. The early Federal trucks ran chain drives, 1-ton to 2-ton capacity, 4-cylinder Continental engines, 3-speed transmissions, are purpose-built for urban delivery where distances were short and loads were predictable. Chain drive made sense for the era. Shaft drives existed, but for sustained heavy loads, they were not yet the proven choice. By 1916, Federal adopted worm gear rear axle drives using Timken systems. This mattered more than it might sound. Worm gear drives are more efficient than chain drives for sustained load carrying over distance. They are quieter. They require less maintenance. The Timken worm was not unique to Federal. Several manufacturers used it, but Federal adopted it when it was still relatively new to commercial truck applications. The engine situation evolved as the trucks grew larger and the demands on them increased. Continental remained a primary supplier through much of the company's history, while Waukesha engines appeared in the midline models through the 1920s and 30s, Hercules in the larger, heavy configurations. By the later years, Cummins diesel engines were available in Federal trucks, specifically the HB and JT models. Diesel versus gasoline in commercial hauling is not simply a fuel preference. It is an economics equation. Diesel engines produce more torque at lower engine speeds. That matters specifically for heavy loads that need to get moving from a standstill and for sustained hauling on grades. Diesel fuel, through the 1940s and 1950s, was consistently cheaper than gasoline. Over the working lifetime of a truck doing serious freight work, the cumulative difference in operating cost was not trivial. Our federal offering Cummins diesel options positioned them competitively with the top heavy haulers of the era. The payload range Federal offered at their peak was genuinely wide for an independent manufacturer. 3/4 of a ton at the light end, 8 tons at the heavy extreme. The medium and heavy models were where the company built its real reputation. The CM series, the CM80, rated at 4 tons, and the CM90 at 4.5 tons, were built for off-road and construction use. Robust frames, adjustable wheelbases ranging from 128 inches to over 200 inches in various configurations. Bodies designed for the specific application, whether that was coal hauling, construction materials, or specialized industrial use. The wheelbase flexibility was a genuine selling point. Federal pushed it deliberately. City delivery operation, shorter wheelbase, tighter turning radius, easier in loading docks, long-haul freight on open roads, extended wheelbase, increased payload capacity, better stability at speed. This kind of customization was not unique to Federal, but they executed it better than most independents of the period. The key was that Federal controlled their own cab manufacturing, which meant wheelbase changes did not require sourcing a completely different body from an outside supplier. It was one integrated system. That integration is what made the flexibility real rather than theoretical. The cabs deserve specific attention because this is where Federal distinguished itself from most of its competition. The majority of independent truck manufacturers in Federal's era did not build their own cabs. They purchased them from body suppliers, bolted them onto their chassis, and moved production. Federal manufactured their own in both standard and deluxe configurations. This was expensive. It was also a deliberate quality statement. A cab you build yourself is a cab you control. Every dimension, every joint, every material choice. Federal's deluxe cab was genuinely better than what most drivers of comparable independent brand trucks were sitting in during that period. Not luxury car comfortable, but better than the industry floor for the segment. The 1950 Styleliner took this philosophy further. 3 abreast seating meant a driver and 2 passengers in the cab simultaneously. For fleet operations where a supervisor, a helper, or a crew member needed to ride with the truck, that practical consideration mattered in purchasing decisions. The Detroit-style design touches were Federal's acknowledgement that aesthetics had entered the commercial truck equation. Buyers in 1950 had choices in a way they had not had in 1930. They were beginning to notice which cab looked like it was built by someone who understood what a driver's working day actually felt like. The military specifications represent the most demanding engineering work Federal ever produced. The 94 X43 tractor used throughout the European theater was a purpose-built machine, 4x4 drive, designed to pull up to 30,000 pounds, rated at 5 tons. Federal built over 8,000 of them. The C2 Wrecker operated on a different plane entirely. 7.5 tons gross vehicle weight. 6x6 drive configuration. Crane system designed for aircraft recovery. The Q9 model, the one that had helped save the company during the Depression in 1934, featured 10-inch deep chassis rails specifically engineered to survive the loads military logistics would put on them. 11,338 military vehicles through that 600-foot line, each one meeting military specifications in a factory that had been civilian-oriented and adapted under wartime pressure to produce what the Army and Army Air Forces needed. 4 Army-Navy E-pennants for production excellence. That number tells you more than any individual specification. It means Federal met the military standard, exceeded it, and kept exceeding it across the entire length of the war. Production targets, quality audits, those delivery schedules, all of it, 4 separate times, judged to be above and beyond what was required. What Federal never had, through any of this, was scale. Scale is the separating factor between a good truck company and a dominant one. You need scale to drive down per-unit manufacturing costs. You need low per-unit cost to price competitively when larger manufacturers enter your segment. Federal built trucks in the thousands per year in the good years. Ford and General Motors built in the hundreds of thousands. That gap was always there. For decades it did not matter much because the big manufacturers were not making serious moves into Federal's specific segments. When they decided to compete directly, Federal was already at the edge of what its size could sustain. The buyer in 1952 was Fauwick Airflex Company, aimed out of Cleveland. Fauwick made the Airflex air-operated clutch. Their specific plan was to integrate their clutch technology into Federal trucks and create a more efficient drivetrain system. The engineering idea had a certain logic to it. What Fauwick did not have was any understanding of how to actually run a complete truck manufacturing operation. This is where things get quietly strange. Fauwick bought a truck company, then discovered they did not know how to make trucks. Not the supply chain management, not the dealer network relationships, not the plant floor operations. They had deep expertise in one specific component. They assumed that expertise transferred to the whole. It did not. 2 years after the acquisition, Fauwick sold Federal again. In 1954, the company passed to Northwestern Auto Parts Company, NAPCO, based in Minneapolis. NAPCO was known for one specific product, four-wheel drive conversion kits for Chevrolet and GMC pickups. They were good at what they did. What they did was not build complete trucks. Different problem, different skill set, different kind of company entirely. The Detroit plant was shut down. The 600-foot assembly line that Pulcher had built, that had run through 2 world wars and 1 depression, that Detroit had renamed a street after, was emptied. The machinery was crated and shipped to Minneapolis. The workers who had spent careers learning the specific rhythms of that line did not go with it. They stayed in Detroit and found other work. And that was the last time a Federal truck was built on Federal Street. The Minneapolis years were not a success. This was predictable in retrospect, here, though apparently not to the people making the decisions at the time. The tooling moved north. The institutional knowledge did not. You cannot pack 40 years of manufacturing experience into a freight truck and ship it to Minnesota. The Golden Eagle series was Federal's last genuine product push, wraparound windscreens, modern styling that looked forward rather than backward. It was actually a decent truck. It arrived into a market that had already decided. Federal ceased production in the United States in 1959. The brand limped on in Turkey with bus production for a couple more years. The last Federal bus came off a line in 1961. Then that was the end completely. Diamond T, Federal's longtime rival and the company that had beaten them consistently through the 50s, survived until 1967 before being absorbed into White Motor Corporation. Diamond T at least got absorbed. Federal just got a closing date. The factory on Federal Street did not come down immediately. It stood for years, repurposed into other uses, industrial, warehousing. The building has since been demolished. Parts of the site have been redeveloped. The street name is still there. The ripple effects of Federal's closure hit 300 dealers who needed to find other brands to represent. Fleet managers who had specified Federals for their operations and needed to switch vendors and retrain their mechanics. Workers who had built careers around Continental and Waukesha and Hercules-powered trucks and had to start over with whatever brand replaced Federal in their shop. Now, the trucking industry did not collapse without Federal. Of course not. It adapted. International Harvester, Mack, White, Kenworth, Peterbilt. The trucks got larger and more powerful and more reliable. The interstate highway system, built through the 1950s and 1960s, fundamentally changed what commercial hauling looked like. Longer runs, higher speeds, greater payloads, entirely new economics. Federal missed all of it. The company that had helped build the infrastructure of American commercial hauling was gone before that infrastructure reached its full expression. There is a surviving federal truck in the Iowa 80 Trucking Museum in Walcott, Iowa, a 1951 HRBB model, Cummins-powered. Sitting there as physical evidence that these trucks existed, that they were real, one that someone built them and drove them and depended on them to get the job done. The Iowa 80, for context, is the largest truck stop in the world. It has a museum, and in that museum is a federal truck that almost nobody walking by recognizes. There is also a 1920 Federal at the Nebraska Prairie Museum, two survivors from over 160,000 built. Henry Ford bought Federal trucks, more than once. One of the trucks he purchased is in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. This is at minimum an interesting footnote. The man whose mass production methods and industrial scale helped make Federal's independent business model eventually unviable thought enough of their product to actually own one. History has a way of doing that. The legacy Federal actually left is harder to see than a museum truck. It lives in the standardization of military vehicles. The work Pulcher did personally with the War Department between the wars directly influenced how the American military approached vehicle procurement going into World War II. That procurement approach worked. 11,000 Federal trucks plus hundreds of thousands from other manufacturers, all operating to some degree on standards that people like Pulcher had helped develop and argue for and push through the bureaucracy of the interwar Army. There is also this. Federal Street in Detroit is named after a truck company. The company is gone. The street stays. In a city full of manufacturing history and manufacturing loss, that is not a small thing. Here is what stays with you about Federal Motor Truck Company. They built over 160,000 trucks across nearly 50 years. They survived a world war, a depression that killed most of their competitors, and a Second World War that they supplied with 11,000 military vehicles and 4 Production Excellence Awards. They helped the American military figure out how to standardize its vehicle fleet. The man who founded the company was personally involved in work that shaped military logistics doctrine. Then a clutch company bought them and could not figure out how to run them. Then a 4-wheel drive conversion kit supplier bought them, moved them to Minneapolis, and ran them into the ground in 5 years. Federal's motto was, "You can expect years of faithful service." The trucks delivered on that promise for decades. The ownership chain at the end did not. That is the gap between what you build and who holds the keys when the market shifts. Federal Street in Detroit is still there. The company it was named for is not. That is the story of Federal Motor Truck, the forgotten giant that carried America's freight, won 2 wars, and died because a clutch company bought it. If you have seen one of these in a museum, or your grandfather hauled freight in one, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We do this every week.